I'm Professor Bohdan Kordan from the University of Saskatchewan, and I've been asked to speak about the Maidan, provide sort of an interpretation and assessment of the Maidan, and so I'm going to be talking about the origins, meaning, significance, and other questions regarding the Maidan and the politics of change in Ukraine. I have a paper. It's 18 pages long, 9 points. It's very long. I've timed myself. It's over 45 minutes. I promise I won't give it the 45 minutes, but what I will do, however, is, if you will allow me, to use the paper, delete parts of it, which I think are just simply, well, they can be deleted, but having said that, I'd like to refer to the paper. It's frequently said that the origins of the current conflict in Ukraine are to be found in a deep-rooted dispute over Ukraine's geopolitical direction, east versus west. Between the years 2011-13, the European Union Association Agreement was meticulously negotiated between Ukraine and the EU, signaling a sea change in Ukraine's foreign policy direction, interpreted by Russia's political leadership as a strategic effort by Western interests to pry Ukraine from Russia's orbit. Pressure was applied on the then Ukrainian government of Viktor Yanukovych to reverse course. The pressure had its effect. EU-Ukraine negotiations, already at an advanced stage, were abandoned in favor of a customs union that would have brought Ukraine closer economically and politically to its neighbor to the east. The quick about-face in foreign policy points to the geopolitical dimension of the conflict. But much more was afoot. No sooner than Ukraine's reversal in foreign policy was made public, young people took to the streets, and the Maidan, a Persian word for the place where people come together in community, was born. But what exactly is the Maidan? What are its origins, meaning, and significance? Wherein lies its legitimacy as a political force, and how does this relate to the politics of change that is occurring in Ukraine today? Moreover, what, if any, bearing does the Maidan have with respect to the current conflict, and what are the successes and challenges that lie ahead for all that the Maidan represents? These questions and more serve as the basis of my talk today. The origins of the Maidan. The recent crisis in Ukraine has eponymously been described as Cold War 2.0, a reboot of the historic East-West struggle. It is also said to be a civil conflict. Although the potential is there for both, this does not accurately describe its essence or nature. At issue is the failure of politics during the entire period of post-communist transition and its impact on contemporary politics in Ukraine. The expectation in the immediate post-Cold War period was that the movement toward liberal democracy was inexorable, if not inevitable, and that it would prevail in Eastern Europe. Yet the promise of democracy seemed misplaced. Indeed, the period of post-communist transition, replete with challenges, has been difficult. We all know the story, and it's, well, we all know the story. The seizure of the state by an oligopoly, leading to Ukrainian society becoming increasingly passive and incapacitated as a result. The impotence of the 2005 Orange Revolution, when a new direction was possible, simply reinforced the public's disillusionment and dismay with politics and politicians more generally. Ukraine was not a failed state, at least not in the conventional sense of the term, but the basic requirements and needs of society at the time were left unfulfilled. These included the lack of institutional responsiveness, economic stability, social security, and the rule of law. Still, amongst the citizens of Ukraine, underlying their disappointment was the desire and hope for normalcy. The EU, in this respect, symbolically represented what a normal society and politics might look like. To be sure, symbols are derivative, and being only a semblance of reality, are often disingenuous. The point, however, for a large segment of Ukrainian society, Europe, simply put, represented a reference point, a world, comparatively speaking, that was without corruption, cronyism, and cynicism. It was, in effect, an aspiration. Amongst the younger generation, there was a visceral reaction when the Yanukovych regime, the perceived source of widespread malfeasance and larceny in the country at the time, turned its back on the EU Association Agreement in early November 2013. For young people, abandoning the road to Europe was seen as abandoning all hope for a possible alternative. For them, connected as they were to the larger world through travel, internet, and other forms of social media, the contrast in the choice between Europe and Russia could not have been greater. Russia represented the status quo. Europe, on the other hand, represented the future. The prospect of losing a chance to go beyond the immediate had to be avoided at all costs. The meaning and nature of the Maidan. In Kyiv, the place to where the people naturally gravitated was the main public square, a space where individuals collect, as they often do, during moments of crisis and need. It was here that they would find comfort in numbers and where a sense of purpose appeared. And it was in this square, appropriately named the Maidan, that civic engagement would take place in response to the wretched circumstances in which the country found itself. It was where people gathered to voice their aspirations for a normal life, in contrast to the reality of rampant corruption and cronyism, manipulation, censorship, intimidation, and coercion. The Maidan constituted a civic expression of the hopes and fears of those who aspired to a different world other than the one in which they inhabited. It represented the values associated with a functioning Europe, where rule of law prevailed, the economy worked, governance was informed by the public interest, and the rights of and freedoms of citizens were recognized and respected. As a movement, it was also seen as the only way by which Ukrainians might be able to restore their society in accordance with the rule of law. Most importantly, it was a way by which to insist on the continuation of those principles that were associated with social justice, with a perseverance and determination so intense and passionate that, in the words of one observer, no other outcome would be accepted. The Maidan has been variously interpreted to be either a historical return to the traditions associated with the Cossack siege or the birth of a nation. However, by organizing in both its own defense and those interests defined by the broader needs of society, the Maidan at its very core signified the reclamation by citizens of their own destiny. It represented the revitalization of civil society, a process whereby citizens were prepared to make and shape their own future independently of the state and government. But for this to occur, it meant advocating and working toward establishing a new public order that focused on justice and the common well-being. It also meant organizing a political response to a government and a form of politics that had eschewed political and social responsibility in favor of clientelism and patronage. I know I'm going fast, but I have to beat the clock. They've only allowed 20 minutes here. In many ways, the Maidan constituted a successor to those civic movements of 1989 that had contested the power ideological structure in Eastern Europe. As was now, the weakness of the old system in 1989 had been revealed as societies mobilized in defense of liberty and justice. And as was now, the movement's strength could be found in the verve and commitment of the tens of thousands who were prepared to risk everything. The civic movements of Eastern Europe arguably did not precipitate a crisis as much as they sought to end a crisis brought about by a system that shown itself to be bankrupt. Denying basic human and civil rights, the old system had to be resisted and ultimately defeated. The civic movements of 1989 responded by declaring that the individual, treated as the object of politics, would now be at its center. This repositioning of the individual proved transformational, helping to redefine political priorities while giving character and meaning to the resistance, 1989. The Maidan was similarly informed. Mobilizing the population, the Maidan argued not simply for the removal of the ancien regime, but also insisted on the rehabilitation of the idea that individual right had value, an idea that had to be defended given its centrality to the political project that lay ahead. Restoring the individual at the center of the political project while defending political right, however, requires the full participation of civil society. It is only in this way that democracy can be supported and the critical link maintained between democracy and the individual. For this to succeed, however, democratic participation must be limitless, open, and transparent. The Maidan would necessarily exhibit these characteristics. As a grassroots movement, the Maidan was leaderless, eschewing both established parties and old-style politicians while reproaching those who pretended to speak on their behalf, including the former Prime Minister and oppositionist Yulia Tymoshenko. As a participatory movement, the Maidan attracted a mix of individuals to its camp, young and old, women and men, students and teachers, workers and professionals. Meanwhile, by embracing diversity, where individuals of various ethnocultural and faith backgrounds mixed, mingled, and otherwise cooperated in common cause, the Maidan also proclaimed its progressive and democratic credentials. Amongst its ranks, however, could be counted the paramilitary rights sector and UNSO, radical organizations that subscribed to a narrow ethno-nationalist program. Yet it was precisely the Maidan's insistence on inclusiveness and transparency, allowing for maximum participation, that will lead to these seemingly incongruities and inconsistencies. The populist, multicultural, and politically pluralist features of the Maidan account for its contradictory and at times amorphous character. At issue, however, was humanity coming together in support of an alternative reality that was increasingly being shaped by the Maidan itself. No matter how inadequate the term, revolution captured the change that was developing in social and political consciousness both on the square and within the nation. Legitimacy and the significance of the Maidan. As a political alternative to the status quo, the Maidan necessarily represented a threat to the established power structure. It pledged to bring justice to the lawless and deprive the current authority of its power. The Maidan also openly questioned the manner in which politics was being conducted not only in Kyiv but Moscow as well. By its very nature, the Maidan could not be allowed to exist by those who deemed it a threat. As thousands gathered in the city square, tens of thousands on weekends, and as smaller civic demonstrations erupted across the country, the strength and breadth of the Maidan led the Yanukovych regime and its proxies to resort to coercive means. Rather than intimidating the population, this had the reverse effect, bolstering the numbers as well as the determination of supporters and activists alike. The impasse soon resulted in mass violence, reaching its apogee when in excess of 100 protesters were shot dead by sniper fire, principally by security forces that sought to disperse the protests in an assault on the square. The killings not only galvanized the movement, but also demoralized the police, who defected in large numbers. The crisis had reached a critical juncture. The Maidan's rejection of a political settlement arranged through international negotiation without the Maidan's consent, the public's outrage over the killings, and a feckless political police force compelled the disgraced president and his inner circle to flee. A new government was soon established, informed by the meaning and message of the Maidan. The flight of the discredited president, Viktor Yanukovych, and subsequent formation of a unity government highlighted an important political question. To what degree was the new government legitimate? Legitimacy is central to the crisis then as it is now. Today, in parts of eastern Ukraine, and to a degree elsewhere in the country, there's a perception that the government in Kyiv is putschist. The degree to which the government is understood to be legitimate points to the relevance of the Maidan, not only in the present circumstances, but also for the way forward. The question of legitimacy can be answered from a constitutional perspective or from the point of view of political ethics. I go on in this paper at length about the constitutional perspective and why, in fact, that the government was constitutionally legitimate in its actions and its ability to rule on behalf of the nation. But that aside, I think the more important question has to do with political ethics. And here I give an argument around this particular issue. Legitimacy is not, strictly speaking, a legal constitutional affair. Political legitimacy is considered a basic condition for governing. It derives from the normative status that is conferred by a governed people upon those institutions and actions that are in accord with its beliefs, desires, and expectations. In a democracy, this means the legitimacy of a government stems from the popular perception that an elected government abides by democratic principles. It also means that the government is accountable to the people, legally and morally. From this perspective, the Yanukovych government failed miserably. The interests of the nation were betrayed when the governing elite exercised power for personal venal reasons and resorted to coercion so as to maintain power and silence its critics. In this regard, the government violated the basic premises of just and democratic rule, highlighting not only a failure in duty, but also nullifying its right to rule. Most importantly, these actions also legitimize the right of a people to self-defense, a right acknowledged in international law. It is this natural right, universally recognized as both valid and legitimate under conditions of tyranny and repression, which establishes the Maidan as a source of legitimate power in Ukraine. The significance of this right cannot be understated. It says that the people's will to survive trumps all other political considerations, but it also points to the importance of political action and individual engagement in the project that lies ahead. According to the Maidan, the principle that placed the individual at the center of society and political life was worth defending. This was enormously important on at least 3 accounts. First, by championing the principle, the Maidan emphasized the need for political action. The Maidan was not simply an expression of political grievances, it was an affirmation of the view that political transformation was the only way by which society and the individual might be protected and liberated. In this regard, the Maidan made clear that the way forward would involve political struggle. Second, the Maidan served as a clarion call for individual engagement. Without participation, there could be neither genuine legitimacy nor authority. On this point, the legitimacy of the Maidan rested not only on the principle of collective self-defense, a passive imperative, it also rested with those who would support this principle through personal commitment by actively being involved and serving as witnesses to change. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the legitimate right of a people to self-defense, a right that placed society and the individual at the heart of political life, meant that change driven by elemental concerns was inevitable, albeit difficult. As a symbol of legitimate power in Ukraine, the Maidan has exercised considerable influence on the course of politics. The most visible and practical expressions of this is when candidates in the proposed provisional government were announced. They went to the Maidan where they were vetted before the assembly on the square. Some were approved, others denounced. This vetting of candidates was an acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the Maidan and all that it represented. Importantly, in the vetting process, the Maidan established the conditions for leadership and the parameters within which rightful rule would take place. There were a number of elements to this. The personal record of individuals would be a determining factor as to whether they could hold public office. Additionally, if the government were to retain the confidence of the people, it would have to measure up to the values guiding the Maidan. And finally, if politicians were to earn the respect of the people, they would have to engage in the work that fulfilled the promise of the Maidan. As a matter of politics, this meant the just application of laws, a commitment to the impartial judiciary, strengthening the institutions of the state, weeding out corruption, upholding human rights, securing the economy and the borders, while assisting the poor and providing for the vulnerable. The implications of all this cannot be underestimated. The Maidan serves, in essence, as a catalyst for political change. Moreover, it does so by insisting on a holistic transformation of the existing order. This, however, begins with the individual and their disposition towards the state, towards the values, principles, and the promise of the Maidan. From the politician to the general, from the public servant to volunteer, the penultimate question is the one that relates to justice, fairness, and equality. Are you prepared to support the public good on the basis of economic justice, social solidarity, and the sovereign right of the people to develop its creative potential in freedom and without fear? Yet, was this not also true of the goals and aspirations of the 2005 Orange Revolution, which held as much promise as the Maidan for the future? When the people rose up in 2005 to win back a stolen election, there was just as much excitement and hope associated with the Orange Revolution. Therefore, are not both revolutions the same? And in the Orange defeat, do we not see a similar outcome for the Maidan? This is an important argument, but ignores the dimensional quality of the Maidan, which places a premium on individual responsibility. There's a profound difference between the Orange Revolution and the Maidan. Whereas the Orange Revolution placed its hopes and expectations in politicians and looked to change from above, the Maidan, as a movement that engaged the individual, looked to change from within. The Orange Revolution hoped that the leadership would recognize the moral imperative of change. The Maidan, on the other hand, is aware that the moral imperative rests with the individual and society. Hence, the extraordinary levels of volunteerism and sacrifice in the current conflict. The Maidan has initiated the transformation of the individual and society in Ukraine, a surprising and unprecedented development. I know that we're coming to the end. I'm only halfway through the paper. Oh my word. The rest of the paper tries to situate the Maidan in the current conflict. And what I indicate that is that the situation in Crimea and eastern Ukraine is a difficult one for the government. But that being said, there is a way out. And the solution rests ultimately with embracing the values, principles, the norms that are associated with the vision that was inherent in the Maidan and carrying this forward. In this regard, I talk about sort of the statements by President Poroshenko, where in fact he understands penultimately that this conflict and the whole question of Crimea will not be resolved militarily, but is one that will be resolved politically. And that political solution lies in embracing the Maidan as a kind of alternative template to what is going on in the East as well as in Crimea proper. I go on further to discuss the Maidan and indicate that on the basis of the ideas and principles that are associated with Maidan, this ultimately provides a program by which, in effect, Ukraine may very well emerge out of the difficulties associated with the legacy, the post-Soviet legacy, but also in terms of the current difficulties. I indicate ultimately that there are the wayward attitudes and bad habits and the kinds of structural impediments that are very much part of that legacy that continue to serve as an impediment. But I also indicate, however, that despite this, however, we begin to see these small successes, and I outline ultimately the numbers of reforms that, in fact, speak to the question of addressing corruption, reforming the judiciary, reforming the economy, and so on and so forth. On the face of it, these reforms seem minuscule and insignificant, but you have to put it in its broader context. And the broader context is this, which is a year ago, all of this would have seemed impossible. Now it's doable, practical, and in this regard, the way forward is for this current government to actually embrace sort of the meaning of the Maidan, its message, and to carry forward, if only because there is no alternative. Thanks ever so much.